This is Dance Is Us, a series of podcasts produced and presented by Spin Malta, Malta's national dance company, during the COVID-19 crisis. The letters making up the name Spin Malta, reminding us that everyone has a relationship with movement and everyone has an experience of dance. It's also an opportunity to draw on the opinions, ideas and perspectives of the many voices in our cultural ecology. We'll be talking to dancers and choreographers, as well as artists working in other disciplines, policymakers, curators, writers, directors and thinkers. This week, we're unpacking the theme I for Island, the metaphorical kind and the geographical. How do John Donne's words, "No man is an island," resonate today? Lisa has a background in art history and cultural management and currently works as an associate for the creative industries at Arts Council Malta. Lisa loves to play local tourist, exploring sites and spaces and scrutinising the natural and the built environment through her camera lens. So welcome, Lisa. Thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this podcast series.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Pleasure. So I'm launching today with the question that I've been starting each podcast with, and that is to set the scene and get everyone in the mood for some dance. So tell me, Lisa, what is your earliest or most vivid memory of dance?
Actually, it might be a little bit hard for me to come up with my first memory. So I think it will be more kind of a series or a sequence of memories, and they're a little all interconnected in my head, mainly because actually I was thrown into the theater when I was a kid. My mum had been involved in the theater already for a number of years, and literally at 2 months of age, I was already attending panto. Not that I would remember panto, but I was already attending panto. So a lot of my childhood years, I remember being at the AMADC club rooms. I remember being at the Manuel Theatre. I remember running backstage. I remember Shakespeare and the summer performances at St. Anton Gardens. And I obviously also remember not just the acting, but also the dance. And there was always some kind of dance number. But even more than that, one of my mom's best friends maybe consolidates my love for dance, especially for contemporary dance, if I have to, be precise, were two experiences at the age of 5 in London. I think it's the first trip that I actually actively remember. And my mum had taken me to watch Romeo and Juliet, the ballet. We were seated so high up. Everyone was so tiny, but still, seeing them literally glide around the stage was absolutely out of the world. And besides that, during the same trip, because we were actually trying to live in London at the time, we spent about 4 months or 5 months there. She took me to watch Cats, the musical.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I was 5. I was really tiny. I was the only kid in the whole auditorium. I was on the front row with a revolving stage. I mean, everyone knows I love Cats. Probably, the musical had, contributed to that as well. And I don't know, I was just absolutely mesmerized. And I think a combination of all of these memories together have kind of sealed my passion for not only the visual arts, which is my kind of sector, but also dance and performing arts.
Wonderful, thank you. So just coming on to your own practice, you describe yourself as a curator of words and an editor of spaces.
Yes.
So your practice plays in that space where the two roles are overlapping and interchangeable. I'm just wondering if you could go into a little more detail on this, and perhaps, by discussing one of your projects as an example.
Sure. Actually, perhaps it would be best to talk about 2 projects, if I may, and how kind of the editor and the curator, kind of overlap in both, even though the requirements of each is quite separate and distinct. because actually it's not very easy to explain this tangibly. And when I was having a think about this, even when I was composing my bio, what immediately came to mind was a project that I had a while back when I was actually editor of a small magazine called The Archetype. And even though I was editor technically, there was much more to it than just the articles which were written, which I edited. There was a very holistic involvement from my part towards the magazine, from the design of the skeleton and the thematic of each of the issues, the choice of the photographer to work with, or the photographers to work with on the separate projects, the selection of images, but also when it came to the arrangement within the magazine and how the content was placed. I mean, I chose fonts and sizes. I decided what images went where, what accompanied what. It was, I was playing curator there on a flat two-dimensional surface. And, I was there to ensure flow, narrative, balance, just as I would, try to ensure visitor experience at an exhibition. Mm-hmm. So that is one example, and I hope it kind of at least describes why I personally describe myself as such. Mm-hmm. And another project was a more recent one that I did with Chris Briffa, or rather Chris Briffa had brought me on board when he did the Antiporta project for the Venice Biennale, Architecture Biennale in 2018. I had been approached solely because of my Matadors project, basically, and that's just a visual and documentative project. Yeah. But for the Antiporta project, I assimilated and I brought together various aspects. So the visual research and documentation, but also the experience of hunting for doors and experiencing facades, and sometimes finding open doors, having my own Antiporta, and then being asked to write something about the Antiporta. And rather than going into, I don't know, a descriptive or analytical or heavily research based text, I opted for a kind of a creative piece in which literally I talk about the in-betweenness of being between the front door and the Antiporta and being stuck in between and feeling that claustrophobia. So actually, really, in many ways, I think my words and the way I write often helps me make sense of images, visuals, and experiences, whilst the visuals complement and accompany the words. I think I need both. And I mean, for me, they make the perfect marriage. And I can't imagine a time in which there's one and not the other.
Yeah, of course. In fact, I was just imagining you in that Antiporta. You were saying it felt claustrophobic, but I was thinking the opposite, that that's kind of where your work is. That's where you are. You have the doors on either side opening out into, to both fields, and you have the option of left or right. It's not claustrophobic at all.
With the Antiporta, it was also playing on the notions of hesitation, because obviously when the Antiporta was created to kind of allow people to understand that they could just barge in, basically, there was that sense of comfort. And nowadays, a lot of people still leave their front door open and their Antiporta closed, but you would never imagine just barging in, Privacy has changed, the way the dynamic between people has changed. There are very few people I would ever feel comfortable enough with to just literally go and ring their doorbell. So with an Antiporta, it's taking it even a step further. But anyways, I don't want to digress.
You don't do the popping. Okay, so if we could just now draw this conversation into this idea of an island. Malta is part of a tiny cluster of islands in the Mediterranean Sea, as we know. And as someone who loves to play tourist and create new narratives from the images and words you collect, can you share any observations or even direct experiences which suggest that our geography really does set us apart?
Yes, I like to describe myself very much as tourist, and mostly as a local tourist, because I'm constantly exploring. You know, I have this I don't know why and where it came from, but this insatiable thirst, you know, to absorb as much as I can of these islands. And I'm always and continuously surprised with how much is still left to discover, even though it's so small.
Yeah.
However, admittedly, I haven't lived in many countries, Nicole. I mean, I've lived in London for a short period of time and in Rome. But as contexts and cities, they are very different from one another. And again, each of them is very different from Malta. Our islands have a very distinct flavor. They have this vibe and a tone which I haven't found elsewhere. And one of the aspects, I think, which I find is very underestimated is our light, you know, the light in the country. And I at least my own personal projects and my photography, if I can call it as such, does revolve around me chasing light. You know, I have literally this love affair, I feel. My favorite time of day is dusk. And even though a lot of people refer to it as the golden hour, you know, and they talk about the kind of the honeycombed hues on the limestone, for me it's not as peachy or as orangey or as golden. I go towards the end of the golden hour when it literally becomes this kind of rosy, dusty, purpley pink, if you like. And that is when I really feel that there's a certain magic which literally is imbued everywhere. And like I said, you know, I find these qualities are overlooked, and this is what makes the island really special. I mean, together with certain scenes which, I mean, if I have to describe them and no one has ever really experienced them, some people might say, oh, come on, you know, pull the other leg. But
for example,
I don't know, walking through Sigewi Square and finding this man having a siesta at 3 o'clock in the morning in the shade with a tank top and with his, and with his nipples out, you know, a glorious scene to behold. And I feel so privileged. Or I don't know, going to Manuel Island and seeing the horses bathing, or even, you know, in Bahar Cha and along the coast road, having the same beautiful and unique experience of witnessing these things. Or I don't know, even seeing a woman doing lace in her doorway and the side streets of Victoria. Or I don't know, I mean, at the moment, whenever I go out to have a walk, I mean, living in Hamrun, there's always someone walking their horse like they're walking their dogs. You know, I mean, I have never experienced this elsewhere, even on Sundays, you know, when people go out with their horses, you know. I mean, once I remember I was with a friend of mine, with an English friend of mine, and she said, do you have a lot of gypsies here? Because she saw a man and a kid going past, you know, in one of these small race carts. I'm like, no, this is really a common practice here. And really and truly, the visuals here, for those who really want to see them, abound.
Yeah.
But you can't just look. You can't be a passive kind of onlooker and just, you know, walk through the streets. You have to actually see. Sometimes you need to frame portions, you know, eliminate a little bit of the chaos, because there is a lot of chaos as well. But there are a lot of perfect portions of reality, as I like to call them, when you do stop and notice. I mean, it might take a little practice. Sometimes it takes another person to point things out, but I always say this, I know at the risk of repeating myself, once you open your eyes and you see, you can't stop seeing, and that is quite a wonderful thing, I feel.
Yes, and keeps it fresh constantly. So if we just moving more into talking about artists and the creative industry, which you're very involved in Malta. In the natural world, the insularity of an island is thought to result in greater diversity in species. It's called island biogeography. And I'm wondering whether you think that this theory might be applied to human creativity or the cultural ecosystem on an island, such as Malta.
I'm a little scared of getting into trouble for my answers with this one, Nicole, but but here goes. It's true. I've been involved now in the sector for a while. I mean, even before I actually started working at Palazzo Falzon, I had already been studying art and observing the context around me. And I have to say that from my experience, there is nowhere near enough diversity of species when related to human creativity here. I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions to the rule, but there are always exceptions. But I have to say that I do observe a certain sameness, especially when this is related to visual art. I'm not competent or knowledgeable enough to be able to say the same when it comes to other art forms. But for example, I mean, we're just seeing, let's say, an emergence of performance art pieces and performance artists. There have been very few and far between, with going back to people like Cesar Attard, for example. But I find artists emulating others, almost copying them at times. There are a lot of variations on a theme, for lack of a better way of putting it, perhaps. And I think it's hard for practitioners to stand out here because, well, actually, I mean, when an artist possesses a very distinct voice, defined by their style and their stance and their positions, their work becomes really known and remembered quite easily. However, I find that those who have this distinct voice find few challenges here, and they opt to use it elsewhere, unfortunately. And that's why I think they're often misunderstood. They feel misunderstood, unappreciated, and undervalued. I don't think perhaps they find enough assistance here, or they find enough people like-minded people with whom they can collaborate, with whom they can engage, with whom they can take projects to the next level. And I don't think maybe that they find the audiences that they are seeking either.
Audience development is quite a challenge.
Yes. I think the artists, they seek validation elsewhere when they're really good. And they often, unfortunately stay abroad.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem to be a characteristic of an island. I'm originally from a huge island continent called Australia. And even there, because Australia is quite remote, there was always this lament about the brain drain, especially in research and science, but also in the cultural sector, that people would leave and then not bring that, that experience, that capital back with them. Has that been part of your work in the sector here, to find ways to bring people back to the country with that experience, having studied abroad, developed their artistic practice? Or have you seen an increase in people returning? I feel that I have.
There are a few people who return, but I think they need reason to, and sometimes what I've observed is that they come back for a short time and they leave again because they become very restless.
Yeah.
I mean, they do seek validation. I mean, I have seen a shift, but it's been a very, very slow shift. And I have seen people like on mobility, for example, on export, but not on import. I mean, the only way you can import or bring artists over to collaborate with must be through a project. And I mean, even though Malta is very lucky to have a lot of national public funds dedicated to the arts, still the capping for a project is quite small when you have any kind of collaboration with international artists or even Maltese artists living abroad, you know, that the spend just increases incredibly.
It does. And I think this kind of brings me into my next question. You've been responsible for developing and implementing programs for artists in Malta to create work for both local and international audiences. So from this experience, have you been left with any impression of any distinctive qualities or ideals which in your opinion shout Islander? And if that's the case, when are these characteristics of help or hindrance?
To be perfectly honest with you, I'm not entirely sure about this question, and should I go completely off track, please set me back on the right road. Because really, rather than qualities, what I have observed is rather a preoccupation or a focus on certain themes, like for example, the sea, for instance, and the idea of borders or boundaries. I mean, I've seen these themes and subjects tackled by artist groups, like Start way back when, by documentary photographers. Even the Valletta Film Festival, for example, they have a section in the festival for islanders. I've seen it tackled by artist groups like Rubber Bodies. And I think it's quite inevitable for a creative's work not to be influenced by certain elements and to respond to them accordingly. I mean, this is really the same with the subject of migrants or asylum seekers, which has been a recurring subject in many artists' work. And maybe it's time for them to start seeking new ways of representing and featuring this subject in their work. But then again, I noticed that there are other issues which are not tackled, which remain quite taboo. And in this respect, and I hope this is not going to rinse, I think the context provides a lot of fodder for creation, yet the conservative outlook and the attitudes provide very much of a hindrance. And I do think artists do, adhere to a lot of self-censorship, really, when producing their work or when showing their work, not necessarily producing, because I have encountered artists who have told me, yes, I've tackled the subject, but I would never show it.
And that's the self-censorship.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question coming back to your own practice, because we're very aware that we're speaking to you as someone who has an artistic practice and also has this cultural management role in the country. So in your own practice, do you very often come across dance or choreography? Has that formed any of the storytelling or gathering in your own work?
Well, actually, in my own work, it doesn't. It's strange because it doesn't feature at all. However, as relating back to your first question, I feel like I have a very intimate relationship with dance and with movement. Funnily enough, and I will never be able to explain this, I dream that I'm dancing. Very often it's been a recurrent dream and a constant one for many, many years.
Lucky.
I mean, I'm a very musical person. I dance all the time alone at home. I sing alone at home as well. And I'm very easily transported by a piece. I mean, I having danced for a couple of years when I was a young teenager, you know, looking back, I don't think I had the discipline to pursue it, perhaps. But also, I must admit, I wasn't a fan of the cattiness with, you know, with some of the other girls and a bit of the bullying, you know. But I've secretly, very secretly, but I guess now I'm saying it here, it's not so secretly anymore. I've always wanted to be agile and flexible. I've always imagined myself as this ethereal figure who glides effortlessly, you know, across a surface, across a stage, you know, rather than, you know, being, well, at least I see myself sometimes a bit clumsy or a bit oafish. So that's a little secret which I'm revealing right here.
But that. I mean, I will tell anyone who listened that I should have been a dancer. You know, that's my unfulfilled dream.
But I'm actually really enthralled by dance, Nicole. I mean, I think it's never featured in my work because I don't think I would be able to add anything to it. I mean, I'm so mesmerized when I watch someone dance that I wouldn't want to photograph it. I wouldn't want to miss anything. And neither would I want to write about it, because how can you describe that myriad of movements, you know, the technique, the style, the grace, the emotion, you know, in the movement? How can you pack it up into a series of words and sentences? I think dance goes a little bit beyond that, you know. For me, it's one of the art forms which just needs to be experienced, you know. Just have to soak it and absorb as much of it as possible, as much as the eye and the brain can perceive. And, you know, you just allow it to take you over, literally, and get lost.
There is that. But also, you know, as I mean, you know, as a selling point here is the National Dance Company, Spin Malta does have a lot of outreach programs, public programs that try to, you know, go through this process of demystifying and making it more accessible. So I will give you some tips, some programs you should participate in. Movimento for one, but we're launching a new website soon, so it will all be there.
Amazing.
You did mention earlier, we just touched on that, you mentioned borders, and I wanted to come back to that idea. You know, many places, particularly in the EU, have held to this idea of a kind of borderless cosmopolitanism, where culture and ideas and bodies flow freely and without fear. And now we see borders more and more. This has been, you know, it's been becoming more visible in recent years. And just also in light of what's happening at the moment, I want to ask, how do you imagine our artists and venues and festivals and institutions might adapt?
Well, I mean, really and truly, I've been asking this question to myself over the past few weeks. And to answer you, I mean, my short answer is honestly, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, right now, everything has already or is in a process of shifting online. And personally, I mean, I have to admit that I'm desperately trying to come to terms with it all and catch up. I mean, I'll admit also that I'm not very big on, you know, virtual connections and virtual experiences. I find it quite cold, and to me it doesn't do much in terms of gifting you with a lasting experience. I appreciate, however, that many measures are being proposed and adopted precisely because it is the only way at the moment of expressing, communicating, or performing. However, it's not a replacement, and it can't be seen as a replacement. I am, however, surprised, impressed, grateful that a lot of artists are thinking outside of the box. They're leaving their comfort zones, and at least they are attempting to make changes. in order to respond accurately to the times we are living in. And also, if I may, I think they are and they have already adapted, because the shift has happened and is happening amazingly fast. But one thing that I don't think is being said, and I hope I won't be hated for saying this, a lot of people what a lot of people don't say is that living in the 21st century, we already spend a hell of a lot of time on our laptops, on our PCs. We're already connected online most of the time, and it's already a burden to some people. It is to me, at least. And the situation presently has forced us to do that even more. There's an obligation to work from home. All meetings have to be held via phone or video chat. Talks, seminars, conferences, a fitness instructor, everything is being done remotely. And even art has to be consumed in this way. And it's too much. It's too much for me, and I suspect there are more people who feel this in this way and who feel the pressure, especially after 4 or 5 weeks, and who are already feeling exhausted about all this kind of all this consuming online. And I really think, and I don't think I can stress this enough, that we need to be aware of and sensitive to breaking points. After a short period of time, I feel there's already an oversaturation, and the risk is that people will gradually start pulling away and finding alternatives which are much more simple and which involve, just maybe being alone and doing things alone, like even just going out for a walk rather than, watching something online. I mean, I've had this conversation with a very close friend of mine. For the first couple of weeks, she was always online any time of the day, constantly plugged in. And yet now, after 4 or 5 weeks, she's becoming more and more reluctant, answering to fewer messages, engaging less. I mean, I think it's inevitable, to consume all at one go and then to start kind of, retreating, if you like.
Yeah.
But I just think we need to be aware of it. So I don't really, have an answer, and I really do hope this is temporary, because, I mean, as a policymaker, as a cultural and arts manager, we're looked to come up with solutions. And I mean, a few solutions we have come up with. I mean, I'm quite proud that on the Arts Council website we have a section which is literally dedicated to COVID and to the situation right now. In the space of a week, we managed to come up with a special call for the Malta Arts Fund, and we are encouraging but not obliging applicants to respond to the context and to tackle themes such as confinement, borders, boundaries, isolation, and to propose projects which deal with new media and digital technologies. And I'm really happy, that I came up with this initiative, which was originally proposed as a priority area, perhaps within the project support grant call, but which was then put aside and dedicated a special call to itself. I mean, so we are trying in our own ways, and I don't know. I'm left with a lot of question marks myself, Nicole, on this.
There are many question marks. Yeah.
I just want artists to be courageous, and I really hope that they're creating some amazing stuff that they can't wait to show everyone else. But I just hope that they don't just leave it all online. That when this is over, they'll come back as a force to be reckoned with.
Yes, hopefully they'll be fearless. That's what we need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just drawing conclusion to discussion. this idea that islands are thought of as places where life flows at a different pace and with an alternative ethos. And I wonder how, well, if there's a way that we work this to our advantage, and just from your personal perspective, what it means to be an island in the Mediterranean. I mean, it's a question that I know Paolo and I have asked in our recent work recently, you know, that in the Spin Malta, you know, business plan, that there's this statement about representing a Mediterranean aesthetic even, and we've both sat back and questioned that. What does that actually mean for us? You know, we can say these things, but really, if you dig deep, what does it mean? Do you have any view on that?
Well, actually, I don't really have an answer to this. I don't think I ever shall. And actually, I hope I never shall have a real answer to this, because really I think it's quite a privilege to live and work on an island in the Mediterranean. I mean, there is meaning and beauty which I try to discover and unravel, you know, on most days, let's put it this way. I mean, different periods, different happenings, even the present one, you know, teaches me something. I mean, I'm finding a beauty in our urban, you know, streetscapes and contexts, which I had never been able to experience before. Our spaces are always so full of people that you can't notice the entirety of detail that you can now. I mean, and plus we have Malta is such a little, I don't know, it's a stepping stone. It's so strategically placed, you know. There's so much desirability to being in such a position, you know. We're at a crossroads. We're between Europe, between Africa, and I mean, what is so amazing is that we're cut off from everyone, and yet we're so connected.
Yeah.
But the cutoff part is what I find interesting, because I mean, let's say when you're in Brussels or when you're in Germany, you know, it's so easy to hop on a train and just be in another country in, I don't know, in an hour and a half. With us, you have to physically get on a plane, you know, you have to leave the ground. And I find this is part of the charm of the island. I feel that this being cut off is what makes us want to leave, but it's also what makes us want to come back.
And I think it's important if you can, you know, you have this incredible optimism. So I think it's a matter of taking that idea that we're cut off, but approaching it through this optimism that you bring to it, you know, to always walk around with your eyes open, to look up, to, you know, see things in a fresh way, rather than, you know, see it as monotonous or get bored with the everyday, because it's so.
And I hope that it always will. I mean, the incredible amount of construction which is going on infuriates me quite a bit, and I hate, you know, seeing trees being cut down to have roads widened. But I mean, I really wish that more people could see how special, you know, this context, this little island that we have is. I really wish they could begin to appreciate it for what it is, for how it is, and not try to make it into something that it is not. There is a very unique flavor here, which I started off by saying, you know, and we underestimate it, we overlook it completely. I mean, all these skyscrapers and these glass buildings, you know, you can literally lift them out of our context and place them in anywhere else, and it wouldn't make a difference. That is not what makes us unique. Our identity, if we do have one, is not made up of that. It's made up of a lot of many tiny portions, and it's those that we have to safeguard, you know. And I feel really, really strongly about this, and I think this is why maybe I'm optimistic. Maybe people call me a bit of a dreamer, and I don't mind that. But I hope I never shall stop dreaming, and I hope actually that it could be infectious, and that other people could, you know, start looking at the island and at our context and in a more similar way that I do. Not in the same way, because it's impossible, but more similarly maybe.
So that's such, I think that's such a great note to end on. Thank you so much. It's been really great.
Thank you.
Today.
I hope I haven't rambled on too much, Nicole.
I think that, yes. No, we're very grateful. Thank you. It's been great having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Nicole.